Okay, so I'm ready to start assembling my mold. I'm opting for glue and pin nails because I've decided that there's not really any reason why I might disassemble this mold in the future. If you foresee yourself potentially needing to break down a mold because it's too heavy to transport, or because you want to reuse the materials, or because you want to repurpose it as a jig, particularly if you're running it over the table saw and you want to remove some screws, that can be really useful. Otherwise, glue and nails is going to be the fastest and most efficient way to assemble this. So I'm going to start with one of my internal ribs and just lay down a light bead of glue in my dado groove. And press that in to fit. Double check that it's fully seated on both sides. And then add a couple of pin nails. And I still have my lines from when I was originally laying out the piece, so that's useful. My nail gun is set at 90 psi, which is a good pressure for driving nails. And you don't need too many. Really, it's just to help clamp the glue until the glue dries. Okay, so that guy's fully seated. Now I'm going to add those little chunks of MDF that I cut as a compressive reinforcement between my two outer ribs. So I'm going to put a dab of glue on these guys as well. And if you're screwing these guys, they really don't need that much support because they are wedged in between those two ribs. I'd say the only thing to keep in mind is you just don't want these falling down inside your mold after it's completely assembled. So at least put one nail or one screw in there to keep these upright, or even just a little dab of glue will work fine. Again, I'm not too concerned about the placement of these chunks. They're mostly there to act as reinforcement. So I'm allowing plenty of height between the tops of the chunks and the ribs, about a 1/4 inch to a 1/2 inch to allow airflow throughout my mold. So now that I've attached those little compressive reinforcements, I can now put an outer rib in to capture them. Make sure that that's fully seated on both sides. And I guess I could have also added an additional bit of glue on my compressive components. So I'll just add that quickly. So I'm going to assemble the other two outer ribs first and then put in the center rib last. So while I'm waiting for my glue to dry on my ribs, I'm going to start getting ready to skin my mold using 1/4 inch bendy ply. We have a full sheet, I believe, of 1/4 inch bendy ply available to you at the shop, but if you're making a particularly big mold, I'd encourage you to buy your own. So I've cut this 1/4 inch bendy ply to the length and width of my mold surface. To measure the length of my mold surface, I just used a cloth measuring tape for accuracy. You can also get pretty accurate with a standard measuring tape. So first thing I'm going to do is I'm just going to hold up the end of my bendy ply flush with the end of my ribs and mark out the center of all of my ribs, because I'll be stapling these onto the top of my ribs. So I want some reference lines to follow. Okay, so as I square up my bendy ply with my mold ribs and I get ready to shoot some staples in, I'm sort of right on the edge of what this bendy ply can comfortably bend to. So potentially, if this mold was really important to me, I would actually cut a couple kerfs in the back of the bendy ply to sort of relieve some of that stress. You can also see that I started to partially crack the bendy ply right there. I'm hoping that with enough staples I can avoid recutting any piece. And it's going to be really important that this bendy ply runs nice and square to your ribs so that the cross grain is perpendicular with the ribs. And I'll be shooting staples in at a 45 degree. After that first staple, I'm going to recheck that I'm actually square to my piece so that the bendy ply won't run off. And then I'll staple an entire row all along my ribs. Next, I'm going to kind of shove the bendy ply down in the front, put in another row of staples. I discovered something new about bendy ply that I didn't know before. While I have bent it at this tight a radius previously, I've never had a double bend curve or an S curve quite this tight. And bendy ply, because it prefers to bend in one direction, every single time that I would pin down the bendy ply into this tight concave curve here, as soon as I started to bend it in the other direction over the convex curve, the bendy ply would start to crack. So I've given up on bendy ply for the moment. I've decided to go in a different direction. I'm going to be doing my skin out of chipboard. So I'm going to be using 4 layers of chipboard. So I cut 4 little pieces of chipboard here and just tested my staple gun until I got to a good air pressure where it was still sinking into the chipboard but also supporting it. And just to make it a bit more stiff, I'm going to put a layer of glue. So I'm going to kind of treat this like a lamination, just a lamination that I'm tacking in place with staples. So my PSI was originally at 90. Right now it's at 60. I'll test it one more time. And I've lightened it up a bit because I want the staple to sink into the chipboard, but I don't want it to punch all the way through the chipboard, which is what it did the first few times I tried. Okay, so I'm gonna go glue up my chipboard. I'll come back here and start tacking it onto the ribs. So I've applied glue between my 4 layers of chipboard. Now I can start tacking it in place. First, I'm gonna try to get it lined up the sides of the ribs so that it won't drift too far off course. I'm just checking again to see that I still have a flat all the way across my bend, and I do. I just have to steer clear of those edges that are kind of puckered up a bit. So this worked a lot better than I was hoping for. Okay, so this entire process took me way longer than it normally does. And the main reason why it took so long is because I made this bend for standard thickness veneer. I made the bend quite sharp in an S shape. And then I decided I would actually bend 2 laminates simultaneously on this mold. So I'd make it double wide and therefore sort of highlight the usefulness of a vacuum on an extra wide mold. Normally I would just make a single solid MDF mold, but because I made it double wide, I did make it ribbed. And because it has such a sharp curve, I had a lot of difficulty finding a substrate that would bend to the sharp curve while simultaneously not deflecting between those ribs. So I initially started off with 4 layers of chipboard. Those bent really nicely onto the mold, but once I put it into the vacuum bag, you can probably see here, it started to deflect between those ribs. So then I layered on top of that 3 layers of poplar 1/16 veneer. And the poplar veneer is a cross grain, so using the strength of the wood that it already has across the grain to build up a layer 3/16 deep or 3/16 thick that would resist the bowing between the ribs. So I finally got it done. I think just about everything that could have gone wrong did go wrong, but I would have to say in all the years that I've been building vacuum molds, this one has by far been the most frustrating for me. So I think there's a good chance you all will have a much better experience with your vacuum molds. But definitely learned a lot of things about vacuum molds today, about what kind of curves that bendy ply will take, about how to create an alternate substrate that won't bow in between the ribs, and then also how to patch that substrate when it inevitably cracks as you're laying down the last layer. So I've taken a sanding block and I've knocked down all of these hard edges. I don't want any corners or edges snagging my bag. The bag is pretty expensive, so you really want to take care of it. Similarly, when I put my mold in my bag with my glued up laminates, I'm going to put a layer of plastic over my laminates to make sure I don't get any glue on the inside of my bag. As that glue chips sort of build up in the vacuum mold, it can eventually puncture the bag. And then lastly, I'm going to lay down some packing tape so that my laminates don't get glued to the mold that I just spent way too long making.